Ah, the magic of electricity, the glories of light. Where would we be without them? It's terribly dark in here. I must find some way of making light. Rub two sticks together. Oh, that's absolutely useless. A flint, that's always good for light. Oh, matches. Matches, now they're always reliable. Sir Joseph Swan, the inventor of the electric light bulb, was born in 1826, and he described his youth as being in the Dark Ages. He was born, he said, when the solitary blaze of the hearth, the tallow dip and the rushlight were the common forms of indoor lighting. Poor people, he said, normally went to bed when the sun went down. Well, here I am, suitably poor because of the miserable pittance that we television presenters are paid, and I've got my solitary blaze of the hearth, and very nice it is too, and I've got my tallow dip as well, which I have to tell you is not quite so nice. I'll just light another one to demonstrate a little bit extra light here. Let's raise a cheer to the humble match and to the memory of John Walker, chemist of Stockton-upon-Tees, the inventor of the friction match. He invented them in 1826, and not a moment too soon apparently, because until he did, the only way to light a candle was by using these. And apparently there was hardly anybody in the country who was capable of striking a light in less than 3 minutes. So what a godsend the matches must have been. Do you know that by the middle of the 19th century we were using 300 million of them a day? So, to the match. Anyway, I was saying that tallow candles are not all that nice, and that's because they pong, they stink, they're rancid. Am I making myself clear? Somebody, I can't remember who, described tallow candles as illuminated smells, and that's about right. The problem is, you see, the tallow is just animal fat. Pig fat or sheep or cow, anything with a bit of fat on it could be rendered down into tallow. To be honest, you didn't even need to render it down. In some places, they just stuck a wick straight into the animal and set fire to it. Isn't that a ghastly thought? Would you just put a light to Fido, please, darling? People have been using tallow lamps for thousands of years. The Romans used little terracotta lamps like this. But in more recent times, poorer people use something like this. This is a rushlight holder. This one belonged to my producer's family. Very poor family. Couldn't afford electricity. Terribly sad story. But they were designed to be used with rushes like these, which you could pick from round about, and which you then had to strip down. Here's one that I peeled earlier. And then you dip them into animal fat, into bacon fat, or in this case, into mutton fat. And then you could set fire to them. Rushlights were poor people's tallow candles, and they were really good because they lasted for quite a long time. 57 minutes for a good long rush. It was calculated in 1788. But by George, they still pong badly though. This one has a little extra element. It's got a candle holder for a tallow candle at the side, which you could light on those special occasions when the neighbours came round and you wanted to impress them. So there we are. One blazing fire, 1, 2, 3 tallow candles and a rushlight. I reckon that's about 4 times as much light as there would ever have been in this room when it was first built. I've never told you where we are, actually. This is George Stephenson's birthplace at Wylam, just outside Newcastle. It's a cottage that was built for a working family in about 1760, and they would never have been able to afford as much light as this. If you want to see some proper light, we'll have to go somewhere posher. This is posh. This is the Treasurer's house in York, just beside the Minster. If it wasn't dark outside, you'd see what a gorgeous view it has. But it is dark, so you'll have to make do with the inside and its assorted candles. Not tallow dips, oh no. Posh people wanted white and pong-free candles. Actually, that's not strictly true. It's probable that the servants would have had tallow dips in their bedrooms, but the gentlefolk wanted something which was a little more refined, literally. They wanted something with the impurities refined out. They wanted something that would burn pure and pong-free. And in the early days, that meant candles made of beeswax, which do smell. Oh, they smell nice. Jonathan Swift, who was the author of Gulliver's Travels, said that beeswax candles gave humanity two of the noblest things: sweetness and light. And he was right. After about 1750, whale oil was another source of candle power, and the oil came from the sperm whales, so the candles were known as spermaceti candles, or maybe spermaceti. I've never been sure how to pronounce it. The oil came from the head cavity of the whale, and apparently, you'll find this hard to believe, there was 500 gallons of whale oil in every whale's head. Candle power is measured by spermaceti candles. One candle power is equivalent to the light given by one pure spermaceti candle of 2 ounces, burning at 120 grams per hour. 10 candle power is equal to 20 watts, so there still wasn't a great deal of light available. And they were expensive, these candles. That meant that you had to get as much from your candle as possible, so you surrounded it by glass to reflect the light, to double it. Mirrors would do, and cut glass was fabulous at increasing the light. Painting the room white helped too. The cost also meant that you were a bit mean about using them. In the past, most entertaining took place in daylight to save money, but if you had to have light, you lit as few candles as possible, unless you literally had money to burn. The Duke of Norfolk, for example, had 130 wax candles in his dining room and 50 in the saloon, and the cost was £15 a night, which was a gigantic sum in those days. Louis XIV, the King of France, once had a party in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles when the room was lit with 7,000 wax candles. Can you imagine the heat? One candle burns twice as much oxygen as a human being. It must have been ferociously hot and stuffy. Whew, but most people weren't like that. Not even rich people. You see huge chandeliers in some big houses, but most of the time they weren't lit unless something really special was happening. Even in the poshest houses, the hours of darkness were literally that, hours of darkness, or at least hours of dimness, especially outdoors. After nightfall, towns were entirely dark and, to be honest, pretty frightening. There was the danger of tripping over things. Parson Woodford, a great diary writer of the 18th century, complained one day that it was so dark that he fell down 3 times in the mud before he got... And then, of course, there was the danger of crime. It was dangerous in the dark. People really tried to avoid going out at night. Some places had lunar societies in which they only met when there was a full moon in the hope that it would be a bit brighter when they went to meetings. People used to come back from parties in groups for safety. Sometimes they hired link boys who carried flaming torches, but they were often in league with the baddies and just led you into danger. Oh yes, they were frightening times, the Dark Ages. But it all eventually changed. There came a time when the darkness turned into light. Oh, I've got a terrible admission to make. You're going to be shocked. I'm going to tell you about a major invention, a revolution that changed the way that we look at the world. And it didn't happen in the north of England. Gas. The invention of gas lighting was a technological advance that changed the world. But it was a discovery made by a Scotsman called William Murdoch, who actually worked for a firm in Birmingham and lived in Cornwall. The living room of his house in Redruth was the first gas-lit place. I'm sorry to have to tell you this. However, the good news is that the North, and especially the Northwest, was incredibly quick to take up the opportunity. And in 1806, a cotton mill in Manchester was the first commercial operation in the world to buy a gas supply. It wasn't this one. It was a mill owned by a couple called Phillips and Lee, and it's been demolished. This one's called Quarry Bank Mill, and it's at Stile, just outside Manchester. And I've come here because it's owned by the National Trust, and it has a few remnants still of its original gas supply. Quarry Bank didn't get its gas supply until quite a bit later, and for a long time it was lit by oil lamps, which were very labour-intensive and gave off fumes which caused eye problems. But that wasn't the real reason that factories like this went over to gas. They wanted lots of light so they could work more. They'd already taken to building mills which were tall and narrow with windows on both sides to grab as much natural daylight as possible. But when it got dark outside, everybody had to stop working. Stop working just because it's got dark. Good grief, what a waste. Good quality artificial light like gaslight allowed people to work longer hours, which was tremendous for Britain's productivity. Gaslight fueled the Industrial Revolution, which was very nice for the Industrial Revolution, but not quite so nice for the workers. So Lancashire had the first gas-lit mill. It also had the first town outside London to have gas-lit streets. The Preston Gaslight Company started work in 1816, and Preston led the way in street lighting, and from that moment onwards there was a tremendous explosion of gas, but that would be rather an incendiary thing to say. But gaslighting just took over the country. In Newcastle, it happened just a little bit later, and this is where it happened. Moseley Street, just along from the central station, was the first northeast street to be gaslit, and it happened on January the 13th, 1818. Now, I can't claim to speak for all of them, but I think that any street would be pretty chuffed to have just one claim to fame. But this street has got a second claim to fame, which is twice as big as the first, because Moseley Street was not only the first street in the northeast to be gaslit, but it was the first street in the whole world to be lit by electricity. Now that is a claim to fame, is it not? And it came about because Joseph Wilson Swan had his offices here, and when he'd got round to inventing the electric light bulb in 1880, he lit up the street outside his workplace. Joseph Swan, Sir Joseph as he became later, was a remarkable man in a number of ways. He had a remarkable beard, for example, one of those beards which make even strong men quake. And it's remarkable that he achieved astonishing feats of inventive brilliance despite leaving school at just 13. This is where he did it. This was his home and laboratory. It's in Gateshead in Low Fell, and it's called Underhill. Possibly, though I may be wrong, because it's underneath the hill, underneath Gateshead Fell. It's not the loveliest house in the world, though there's a certain charm about the polychrome brickwork around the windows, but somehow it doesn't matter that it's not beautiful. It's always magic standing in a place that's been touched by greatness, and this house was undoubtedly touched by greatness. The first house in the world to be lit by electric light. Since then, light bulbs have developed in all sorts of ways. They've got more efficient and brighter, of course, but it was Swan who overcame the enormous practical and scientific problems and made the light bulb possible. This is what he invented. At least this is a faithful replica of his original light, owned by the Discovery Museum in Newcastle. Physics and chemistry have never been my strong point, so you're not going to get a brainy explanation of the science involved, but the main problems were making sure that there was a good enough vacuum inside the glass jar, and that the filament was fine enough so that it heated up quickly, but strong enough so that it didn't burn out too fast. Swan achieved his breakthrough in 1879, and the following year, 1880, was one of absolutely momentous progress. On the 20th of October, he demonstrated his lamp at Newcastle's Literary and Philosophical Society, which became the world's first public room to be lit by electric light. And then in December of the same year, he sold the idea of electric lighting to his fellow Tyneside inventor Lord Armstrong to light his great country house at Cragside in the Northumbrian hills. The entirely amazing thing about Cragside is that, unlike most of us, it's got everything. Landscape and contents, all spiffing as possible, but it's also got the most interesting technological history of any house anywhere. Cue the invention of the electrical generator and hydroelectric power. Early attempts at creating electric lighting depended on battery power, but in the 1870s, 1878 I think, the German-British engineer William Siemens invented the electrical generator. Our chum, Lord Armstrong, bought one, but 2 years later replaced it with this Crompton generator. It was driven by water from one of his many lakes and used to power electrical arc lights in the house, making Cragside the first building in the world to be lit by hydroelectric power. Another thing that no longer exists is that collection of 1878 arc lights, because they were replaced in December 1880 by these lamps made to hold Joseph Swan's incandescent lamp bulbs, a much brighter and more reliable source of light. They were described as being perfectly steady and noiseless, free from harsh glare and shadows, casting no ghastly hue upon the countenance. There were about 40 of these lights in the house overall, each producing 60 candle power or 120 watts. By today's standards, not a lot of light for a house of this size. But people used to the Dark Ages couldn't get over the brilliance. And that northern brilliance continued to shine through. It was another Victorian Tynesider, John Holmes, who invented the light switch. So let's hear it for electricity and all those who discovered it, all those who brought the Dark Ages to an end. I love walking at night, especially when you get public-spirited people like these who leave their curtains open and light their rooms with such delicate beauty. But I'm not thick enough to claim that electric light has been a total blessing. I know that it's led to pollution and overuse of fossil fuels. I know that light pollution is a bad thing, and I'm delighted when, like here, councils put up anti-light pollution street lamps, focusing all of the light downwards rather than letting it leak up towards the night sky. One thing I hate, do you know I am a small-minded little man, but one thing that I really hate about light, security lights that come on when you're walking innocently along the middle of the pavement as if every nighttime stroller was some sort of brigand. This programme has all been a lie. Of course, all television programmes are lies. They pretend that what you're seeing is actually happening, but of course this isn't the case. At the moment, for example, there are loads of people watching me. Obviously there's a cameraman, and of course there's a sound man, a producer, and in this programme especially we've needed a lighting man. In this case, John. Now, if we hadn't had John with us, you'd have seen virtually nothing in this programme at all. This is the church of St Maurice at Ellingham in Northumberland, which isn't well known or very old. It was designed by the vicar in 1862, but it's an interesting church from the point of view of light. The story starts here, outside. You can see that in the churchyard there are still the old original gas lamps, but inside the really remarkable thing is that this place is a sort of time capsule of the history of light. It's still got candles and beautiful oil lamps, but it's got modern electric lights as well. It's 150 years of the history of light. It is really gorgeous. Trust me, it is gorgeous, but until John weaves his magic with light, it looks not special at all on camera, even dowdy. This part takes ages, so I usually leave them to it and retire to my trailer. Okay, let there be light.